Wilson. I'm Associate Professor of Philosophy and Translation at the University of East Anglia, where I teach philosophy of religion and translation theory. I had the privilege of editing the new chapbook from Art Publications, If I Only Knew by Nelly Sachs, translated by Jean Boase-Beier, with whom I am speaking today. Jean is Professor Emerita of Literature and Translation at the University of East Anglia. She founded the very successful MA in Literary Translation and is both a translation scholar, whose publications include Translation and Style and Translating the Poetry of the Holocaust, and the translator of several volumes of poetry, including work by Ernst Meister, Rosa Ausländer, Volker von Turner, and Paul Celan. With Marianne de Vogt, she has edited Poetry of the Holocaust, an anthology. Jean is also translation editor for Art Publications. Jean, I'd like to begin by actually asking you to read a couple of the poems from this new chapbook, please.
Okay, it might be possible for people to see this if I hold it up. This is the chapbook, If I Only Knew, as Philip has just said. And thank you for that introduction, Philip, which I meant to say a minute ago. I'll just maybe try and contextualize very briefly, because otherwise the poems don't actually mean very much, and they are contextualized in the chapbook. So Nelly Sachs was born in 1891 in Berlin into a family of assimilated Jews, and of course she had, was in great danger after the Nazis came to power. She managed to escape to Sweden with her mother in 1940, and the poetry that we know as Nelly Sachs's poetry was all written after that. In fact, just after the end of the war, she started to publish. So this first poem, which is the title poem, If I Only Knew, was written in about 1943 or 1944. It appeared in her first book, which was In den Wohnungen des Todes, in the Houses of Death. And it's part of a group of poems which were called Prayers for the Dead Bridegroom. Now, it's not clear who the dead bridegroom was, but as far as we know, it was somebody that she had a relationship with when she was much younger and still living in Berlin. And he seems to have been killed. He might have been killed by the Nazis. We don't know. But in the poem, she's imagining somebody, presumably, going to their death. If I only knew what your final glance rested upon. Was it a stone that had drunk many, many final glances until, gone blind, they fell on the blind man? Or was it earth, enough to fill a shoe, and turned completely black from all this leave-taking, from all this doing to death? Or was it your final path that brought you farewell to all paths you had ever walked? A puddle, a piece of shining metal, perhaps the buckle of your enemy's belt, or some other small fortella of heaven? Or did this earth, that lets no single one depart unloved, send you a bird sign through the air to call back your soul, so it quivered in its body, ravaged by fire? That is one of her early poems, though it wasn't, of course, that early. It was, as I say, 1947 that was published. This next poem, Why the Black Answer of Hate, it was from her second collection, 1949, and this collection was published 1 year after the founding of the State of Israel. And once Nelly Sachs had got to Sweden in 1940, she started to find out what was happening back home to all the other Jewish people and lots of other people back in Germany and back in Eastern Europe. And she started to look into the background of the Jewish people, into her own culture and religion. And she simply started to wonder what had been, why there were all these problems always. It wasn't something she'd been aware of, particularly growing up in Berlin, until the early 1930s. So when she says in this poem, she asks why the black answer of hate to your existence, Israel. She doesn't mean the state of Israel, because when she wrote the poem, it still hadn't come into existence as far as we know. So she means the people, Israel. She means the Jewish people. Why the black answer of hate to your existence, Israel? You, a stranger, from a star one further off than the others, sold to this earth so loneliness can be passed on. Your origins grown through with weeds, your stars exchanged for all that belongs to moths and worms, and yet from the dreaming sandbanks of time, drawn away like moon water into distant lands. In the chorus of the others, you have sung a higher note or a lower note, thrown yourself into the blood of the evening sun, as one pain seeks another. Your shadow is long, and the time has grown late for you, Israel. How far was your path from blessing along the eons of tears, up to the bend where you fell to ash, and your enemy wrote in the smoke of your burnt body your abandonment to death upon the forehead of heaven? Such a death, where all the assisting angels with bleeding wings hung torn on the barbed wire of time. Why the black answer of hate to your existence, Israel? Can I read one more short one, you think?
I think so, yes.
Okay, thanks. So this is a poem, You, My Dead, and it was written very close to the end of her life. She died in 1970. This poem was written in 1969 or 1970. It wasn't published until after her death. And as in all her poems, she's asking questions. Almost all her poems actually ask questions. And here she's questioning her own place amongst those who have died before her, so other Jewish people who have died before her. But she's also wondering in what sense she can actually speak for them. And I should say also in terms of context, just perhaps 3 or 4 years before she wrote this poem, she won the Nobel Prize for Literature. She could never perhaps quite believe that. And I think that's relevant to our understanding of this poem. You, my dead, your dreams have been orphaned. Night has hidden the images. Your tongue sings flying over symbols. The refugee storm of thoughts, your wandering legacy, begs upon my shore. And I am uneasy, profoundly shocked to grasp the prize with my tiny life. Myself, the holder of moments, of heartbeats, farewells, death wounds. Where is my inheritance? Salt is my inheritance. Okay, so those were 3 poems.
Well, thank you very much for reading those poems, Jean. Nelly Sachs is often considered to be a difficult poet by critics and by readers. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about Nelly Sachs is that she changed over time. I mean, everybody changes and every poet changes. But the change was so profound in her case, and it came so suddenly, and she became very difficult. So her very early poetry, when she was still in Berlin, I think it would be easy to dismiss it, really, and she dismissed it herself because she wrote the kind of things that young women write. You know, she wrote about not exactly fairies, but deer and music boxes and flowers, and it would be easy to dismiss it, but actually she wrote this very, very competent poetry. It's very nicely rhymed. I mean, it's very difficult to do actually such poetry, so one shouldn't kind of just dismiss it, I think. But when she escaped to Sweden, by which time she was already in she was middle-aged by then. So she, her kind of what we regard as her early poetry, beginning in 1947, is not the poetry of a young woman. But it starts off being quite explicit, and so her best known poem is "Oh, the Chimneys," and so it's, you know, the early, what we regard as early poetry, her early known poetry from the late 1940s, is full of kind of emotion and exclamations and very clear, fairly clear imagery, although it's starting to get very complex in terms of syntax. But as she went on, her poetry became more and more complicated and complex and sparer, so that you really have to untangle it as you go on. And it sort of reflects her journey, because she was finding out about the past of her people, of the Jewish people. So she read a lot of Jewish philosophy. You know, she read Martin Buber and lots of other Jewish philosophers, and particularly she read a lot of Jewish mysticism. And so, you know, Gershom Scholem, for example. And so you find all the traces of this mysticism and so on in her poetry. But you also find the effects of the translation she was doing. She worked as a translator to support herself and her mother, who had escaped with her. And she was translating Swedish modernist poets, you know, poets like Johannes Edfeld, who are not easy to translate, and this are not easy to read always, and this kind of affected the way that she wrote. So she started to condense her language, and it became more and more difficult to understand, I think. So she's difficult in that sense, and I think this is one reason why people know her earlier poetry, because it's easier. But also I think there's a difficulty about the way she's presented. You get these great volumes of Nelly Sachs's poetry, often with plays in as well, because she wrote plays as well. And it's totally overwhelming. You know, you kind of read it and you can make no sense of it. It's not contextualized. So I think she became a difficult poet, but she's made to be more difficult than she ought to be by the way that she's presented.
Thank you. So what made you want to translate this difficult poet, especially given the fact that other translations do exist in English, including, I think, a couple of quite recent ones?
Yes, I mean, I've been translating Nelly Sachs for many years, and so the decision to publish something did come about around the same time as other translations were appearing. Recent translations were appearing. When I started to translate her, there were already several translations of her work, but I always felt she was misunderstood, and I think she was partly misunderstood because she was contradictory. So, you know, she was contradictory in a way in her person and her life, and also in her poetry. And, you know, what I mean by contradictory, she looked fragile. She was a very small woman with very large eyes, very wide set eyes, very what's the word? You know, if you look at photos of Nelly Sachs, you feel a need to protect her. She's one of these people who just kind of has this effect on you. You know, she looks as though she's going to break. But at the same time, she wrote this kind of incredibly tightly structured and rather overwhelming poetry. So she's a contradictory sort of person, but also her life in itself was contradictory. You know, she escaped to a country she didn't know. She learned a language she hadn't known before, Swedish. She worked as a translator. We all know that is not easy. She supported herself and her mother. She worked all day and often into the night. So she was obviously a very tough character, which is quite at odds with the way she looked. And certainly early criticism, you know, in the 1950s and 60s in Germany, seemed to regard her as a sort of poet of a conciliatory poet, you know, poet of reconciliation, and yet she wasn't. So I think I felt she'd been misunderstood. People had been too influenced by her appearance and said, oh, you know, this nice little poet, she wants everything to be good. She wants, you know, everybody to forgive one another and so on. I'm not sure she probably did want everybody to forgive one another, but that isn't what she wrote. And so, you know, you have this feeling that she's been misunderstood, also not contextualized, because her development was so striking. And unless you see her chronologically, you don't see what's happening in the poetry. So that's another reason that I wanted to present a few poems with which are strictly chronological, so that people can see the development. They can see how the early poetry is explicit and the later poetry is not at all explicit. I wanted to make sense of her, and these contradictions. I think that was the main reason.
Oh, thank you very much. That's very interesting, Jean. And how do you approach the task of translation yourself? Possibly, are you doing something different in the way you translate from the other translators, for example?
Yeah, I mean, different. Yeah, I mean, every translator translates differently. But I think one of the things that is not always taken into account with Nelly Sachs is, well, one thing that's not always taken into account is the vast difference between her early poetry and her later poetry. So by early, I mean not her very early poetry when she was still in Germany. I mean her poetry straight after the war, when she hadn't done all the reading and the philosophical research, one could say. And this was not research in the sense of a lot of other folks' opinions. She actually, I mean, of course, it was in the end other people's opinions, the opinions of philosophers, but she sat down with books and she read and she tried to understand these things and she found out about her history. And so this kind of distinction is important. I think the distinction between the earlier and the later poetry. I think also as I mentioned, the presentation. I mean, I think in order to understand her as a translated poet, as a poet who is going to work in English, you need you need contextualization. I think that was true in German, and it didn't happen usually in German publications, but I think it's even more true in English. So in this chapbook, we've got contextual notes explaining at what point in her life she wrote the poem, and a little bit about what her thinking might be. Very little, but just enough for people to sort of understand what's going on. So it's partly about presentation, I think, but partly also I felt, a lot of people kind of translators went at Nelly Sachs with the idea that she was a difficult poet. And you kind of must translate everything in order for people to be able to see what she's done. And I don't think she was, I think she was difficult, but she wasn't inaccessible. So I have tried to make her the way that I feel she wanted to be. I've tried to get into her head and think, what was she actually writing about? And I've looked at her language very closely, because she uses words in a not slightly, but a very idiosyncratic way. So, I mean, just an example, she uses the word erinnern to remember, but she doesn't mean remember. She means erinnern, to bring something inside. And so she talks in the first poem I read about something which is sometimes translated as reminding the soul, erinnern die Seele, or I can't remember the exact words, but it's actually to bring the soul back inside. You can see it is, because it's the way it's used. But of course, if you translate it thinking, oh, Nelly Sachs, a poet of memory, this must be to remember. I mean, I'm not suggesting translators ever think in those simplistic terms, but you see what I'm saying. I think you need to go deeper into the language and think, why is she saying this? Why is she using this verb without an object or whatever she's doing? What does she really mean by it? What does this mean in terms of the philosophical thinking she's starting to build up? And then I think you get a slightly different take on her. So I would say this kind of real concentration on the way she uses particular words. I don't think you can actually do that if you translate a huge volume of Nelly Sachs. You get so caught up in it, and it does sound, the poetry, some of the translations they sound wonderful, but I wonder if they really go into the meaning of each word, perhaps as much as they could have done if they'd taken a smaller selection.
And of course, that's what we have now, because we've got this smaller selection in the chapbook. So that's Nelly Sachs, If I Only Knew, translated by Jean Boase-Beier. Thank you so much for this interview, Jean.
Well, thank you, and thank you for anybody who will be listening to it. Thank you to them as well.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to join in that.
Okay.